Welcome to episode 2 of Ancient Geeks. I'm Tom Grant,
I'm Stephen Taylor.
and today we're going to talk about Superman, the most iconic superhero of them all, and also our, I would say, complicated relationship with the character. How would you
I think that's
characterize it?
fair. I think that as Superman is clearly central to the entire enterprise of talking about comic books and superheroes, right? In some ways, he
Right.
is the superhero, the proto superhero, the original superhero, with some caveats. Um, I mean, I don't know if we decide. You could argue that maybe people like Tarzan or Buck Rogers and Lone Ranger were the first superheroes of a fashion, but really, the costume superhero whose superpowers propelled them to fight crime. I think Superman's it, right? This is really the one, at least one that sticks. You might find some other examples
Right.
that predated Superman, but he's the one that sticks, and he has become. If anybody knows a superhero, it's Superman. I mean,
Right.
he's called Superman, and he has, and his powers are
Yes.
pretty straightforward, but they're all amplifications of normal human capacities, right? With some,
Beyond those of mortal men.
yes,
Yes. And women, but
yeah.
they
But
didn't mention that.
he's strong, he's fast, he flies. I mean, I guess heat vision, perhaps, and X-ray vision are a little beyond, but still.
Right.
Um,
But he was not our favorite character
no, I
either when we were kids or later when we got heavily into
quite correct.
comics and in comics
Yes,
related media.
I think that's absolutely the case. Certainly, as we'll discuss here in a moment, our initial introductions were not the same as what we discussed last week with Batman or in the
Right.
previous episode. Um, and while present and important, not the same love affair, shall we say?
No. No, he was there.
Oh
He
yes,
was, as you said, the standard bearer of all things superheroes, but
yes,
not our favorite character.
no.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
I'll go so far as to say that I found Superman boring at times because he's just not as exciting to me. But he's also very, very important. So I don't want to discount that fact.
right, and I think our opinions will be a lot more explicable once we get into our discussion of the Superman TV show and the Superman comics of the
Yes,
60s and 70s.
I agree.
But to start, what makes Superman as popular a character as he is?
I think that's part of the mystery, is it not? I mean,
Yeah,
it is. I think the understandability, as I was alluding to a moment ago, I think his powers being fairly straightforward. It's his origin story is not super complicated, although it is fantastical and therefore interesting. But his overall presentation, he is, I think, in many ways, another way he's, I think, a prototype for superheroes. He's almost entirely this force for good, right? He uses his powers for good. He has a pretty clear sort of a code of conduct. There's no He's not threatening in many ways, right? He operates, unlike Batman operates in the dark and he's in the night and he's all this, but Superman's all out in the open, right? He's
right.
also, I think, again, relatively easy to understand. And then I think that sort of propels his popularity. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I was pondering this. It was interesting. Both of us, had this question in mind when we were prepping for this particular
Yes,
episode. I would say Superman is more than human, but he's also fully human.
right.
So it's not just, I think, as simple as, well, Clark Kent humanizes Superman. But I think that just the character really kind of hits a lot of the notes that people identify with. He's the sort of person people want to be.
Yes,
Where Batman's a little more complicated,
yes,
and certainly, as we talked about last time, as the character matured, he became less of an admirable person. Nobody wants to be as psychotic as later generation Batman incarnations were.
right, right,
Superman was always, somebody who touched on nerves in all of us to whatever extent that we're hopeful. about the society that we live in or the people that we would like to be and so forth. I think that truth, justice, and the American way
Yes.
aren't merely corny slogans. It's, people want to be truthful. They believe in some ideal of America. They want justice in some form. And he's not morally complicated. And he is willing, I think also, the other thing I was thinking of was willing to be vulnerable. So as a superhero, wasn't merely that, Batman was more, prone to being put into dangerous situations. It's that, Superman was willing to sacrifice himself frequently in the name of his ideals. He certainly had vulnerabilities like kryptonite and magic and so forth, but those were kind of more gimmicky. It's I think it's no accident that the trailer for the Superman movie that's coming out this year starts with him kind of beaten and bloody. But still, despite his superpowers, he still, it kind of can be harmed, emotionally, physically, whatever. And but he still battles back from that. I think that's something that people admire about the character.
Yeah, Superman always wins, right?
Yeah,
Well, this is true of most heroes. But it seemed like Superman in particular always wins. How do you, again, the only way to beat him is, as you point out, are particular kinds of
hmm,
uh, very fantastical vulnerabilities, kryptonite or magic or something along those lines.
right,
And certainly early on, in particular, the uh, the kinds of villains he fought weren't really ultimately going to be able to beat him and maybe outsmart him in some ways or have fantastical traps. But I mean, it is he is an ideal, right? I think that's part of
right.
what it is. He's an
Yeah,
ideal that other heroes don't quite mesh with, right?
yeah, and an ideal that had resonance at particular historical periods, like World War II,
Yes,
when certainly the, truth, justice, and the American way were front and center in people's minds, both for kids reading the comics on the home front as well as the GIs who would read comics on the front lines.
right.
I would say, like in the 1960s and 70s, the period that we're going to talk the most about, there was a lot of uncertainty, doubt, fear about where the country was going, where the world was going, and Superman is this sort of sturdy flagpole of ideals in which, kind of the banner of truth, justice, the American way is
Yes,
was
yes.
always flapping. Um, I think that might have been something meaningful for that time. I mean, who knows? This time with a lot of internal conflict and uncertainty and fear in this country, that people might respond to the upcoming Superman movie in as electric a way as they did to Superman in 1979.
That's a fair point. Yeah, it is clearly the case that the whole, pardon me, I think the idealism of it all is quite significant. And you're right. I mean, during whether it's World War II, the Cold War, especially the Vietnam era, he is representative of something beyond sort of the turmoil of the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. So it might be that as a comic book character, he was less interesting than he's been as kind of a cultural landmark
I think that's fair.
that people can always find.
Yeah, and I think he embodies a certain kind of Americanism in the sense that he is an immigrant, right? He's not from here, but he's of here.
Right.
Um, and this notion also, I think, which is I'm sure quite powerful, the association of goodness with being American.
Hmm.
That he would be. He would be this hero for the United States in some ways, and not just for the whole world. Although he also, at times, is more of a global hero. But that association, I think, is quite important.
Yeah. Any other thoughts about Superman generally before we jump into
I
the
think we
TV
could talk
show?
about the TV show and our experience with that and with the comics
Yeah.
in our youth.
Yeah. And last time we didn't get to the Batman movie at the end. We kind of debated whether or not to do that for the listener's sake who didn't hear that side conversation before we started recording. This time we will get to the Superman movie, and eventually probably we'll get to the Batman movie. But so we're gonna cover, the TV show, the comics, and to some extent the movie, because I think it's essential for the question that we're asking here of what makes Superman such a popular character.
Oh, indeed, and I think it's worth pointing out, right? I mean, all of these characters probably require multiple episodes for discussion.
Yeah,
Um, but I think it is telling, and maybe it's part of our personal fandom, but it is the case that there is it was easier to envision multiple episodes about Batman in ways that was less obvious to envision multiple episodes about Superman, even in terms of our
right.
origin story sort of era of podcast. So um, Batman's just less has more layers, I guess, than Superman, at least in my mind.
Yeah, and more incarnations. I mean, there
Yes,
was the
yes,
the John Byrne reboot,
yes.
but there hasn't been as many, kind of mutations of Superman over time as there have been of Batman.
Certainly not in I think in our early stage. I think because again, we're thinking in terms of our own experiencing of these properties, right?
Hmm.
Um, in some ways, at least in my mind, right? Superman from when I was a young child into high school and collecting comics did not change as much as Batman did, or have as many
No.
in that time period. Not, it's worth pointing out. We won't talk about it today, but there are a number of, there are far more Superman TV shows than there are Batman TV shows. There are a whole bunch of
Yeah.
shows, many of whom
Yeah.
I've not fully consumed. I'm aware of, whether it's the Dean Cain TV show or Lois and Clark or various other
Hmm.
iterations. Um, Various iterations of Superboy, even, right?
Yeah.
So the character clearly resonates as a pop culture phenomenon, um, but is, I think, more static in some ways.
Yeah. Well, let's
Although,
let's let yeah, let's talk about what it was what it was
sure,
like when we first encountered Superman.
sure,
Kind of like the charter for this podcast starts with that. So, uh, when I was a kid, the Superman TV show, The Adventures of Superman, was in reruns. Which means you watch them kind of randomly. You didn't see episode one, but we'll talk about episode one.
yes,
And it was clearly antiquated already. I watched it as a kid in the 1960s. The show originally came out of the 1950s, and it looked like a 1950s low budget production, with the clothes, the sets, the special effects. I'm making air quotes around
yes,
that.
yes,
And definitely the acting was very 1950s. And it was very clearly pitched at children, not
yes,
at grown-ups.
yes.
But still, I mean, it was popular enough that everybody learned the opening, could quote it,
Oh,
without
yes. Oh,
without
no.
any
Well, it was
hesitation.
on for a number of years. It was on longer than Batman was on.
Yeah. So how about you? How did you encounter it
Same
originally?
deal. I mean, I certainly I cannot conjure certainly my very first exposure, but it's not as vivid to me as the Batman discussion that we had about my mother very purposely putting it on. I'm sure my mother also put this on, but it was as you point out, it was those bygone era where you watch what was on television and you maybe
Right.
had between 3 and 8 choices, depending on the metropolitan area you lived in, maybe a few more. And
Hmm.
what was on, and the amount of genre opportunities was limited. And Superman was at least a superhero doing actiony things, and that was appealing. But yeah, I never was smitten with it any particular way. I do remember sort of the way you remember it, which was kind of boring. It was at least Superman was eventually fighting crime and solving a problem, but it was mostly really following Clark Kent around and Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen and Perry White yelling at people.
Yeah.
But and then Superman would sort of appear, jump through a window, do this, do that.
Right. It was 95% Clark Kent and 5% Superman.
That's yeah how I recollect it. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, just watching some episodes, for example, there was one where Superman, or actually more Clark Kent, becomes the adversary of a mob boss, and somebody in Hollywood is making a movie biography of the same mob boss, and this kingpin doesn't like the idea, and so Clark Kent goes to Hollywood, and obviously Superman is there as well to occasionally save the day when people are endangered, but it's really a marginal part of the story.
Yes.
Just pop up, keep a train from crashing or something, and that's it.
Right.
And he goes
Right.
away.
Right. Um, it kind of reminds me. I think as a child, in shows like Superman, not just Superman, but any show that had a superpowered character that required even minimal, again, air quote, special effects, the superhero would only show up in limited fashion in a way that,
Yes.
like, even as a kid, I'm like, well, if you're Superman, why don't you just solve this problem now? Why do we have to wait for the climax for you to show up and use your powers?
Right.
Um, but obviously, it was the limitations of the special effects budgets. Um,
Yeah, so for those who haven't seen the show, you'd see Superman occasionally flying, but you'd really kind of only see the upper half of his body, usually
yeah,
coming in from the right side of the screen,
yes,
and that would be superimposed over stock footage of a city or a forest or something that he was flying over in the background.
yeah, he was either suspended on wires.
Yeah.
And I did read or did some research that apparently the wires broke several times to the point that he got very frustrated because he was falling from relatively great heights.
Yes.
They created a platform that he could lay on, that he would look like he was flying. And again, using this
Hmm.
sort of superimposed old, very, very early kinds of special effects. Lots of leaping out of windows. The
Yes.
whooshing sound effect did a whole lot of work.
Yes. Or jumping into the shot.
Yes, yes, yes,
It looked like
exactly.
he was like on a platform and then jumped down to make it seem like he was landing.
Just had a flash. I mean, even the greatest American hero had better special effects than this show.
Well, I mean, we're
Yeah.
laughing at it, but I have to credit the TV show's ingenuity in trying
Oh,
to
sure.
work within the
I mean,
limits that they had.
it was the 1950s. There's that's certainly fair. In TV, it's just a whole different era at that point in terms of special effects. So
Yeah.
yeah, but I think, as I was pointing out, I think clearly the stories were limited by what they could put on screen. I think another thing that I didn't care for as a child was that, on balance, the adversaries were mundane, right?
Oh, yes.
And we can maybe we should talk a little bit about the first episode, which I'm sure I'd seen, but had no recollection of. I rewatched it or watched it for the first time, depending, because again, with reruns, who knows? You may never have seen a particular
Yeah.
episode. But I'd forgotten or did not realize there was an origin story. They did the whole Krypton blowing up business, and then
Hmm.
the Kents, excuse me, finding the Clarks, the Kents
Yeah.
finding the baby, and all that business. Although, I was sort of amused that Pa Kent was named Eben, I think, in
Yeah.
the
It was,
which
as I was
I
going to say, it wasn't the
yeah,
names of the comic book
no.
parents.
Um, but it was again, it was. I mean, I watched enough 50s TV. It was just, for reasons already explained, because that's what there was. That's what was on. But it was just a plotting,
Yeah.
linear, very specific kinds of limited camera shots. Not particularly great acting. Not particularly great. I mean, it is what it is, or was what it was.
Yeah. And
Um,
it had sort of like a feel of serials, like
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
Krypton sequences kind of
Yes.
reminded
Oh,
me of
yes.
Buck Rogers or
Yes.
similar sorts of, actually not 1950s but 1940s or
Yes. The other
sort of
the other comparison in
productions.
my mind, I'm sorry, was just westerns that I'd watched at the time.
Yeah.
The basic structure of the show was not dissimilar from, I don't know, The Rifleman or something like that.
But yeah,
It just
I had exactly that in my notes that it was like Bonanza,
yes,
right?
yes,
There was or
yeah,
Route 66. There was
right,
a
yeah,
problem that week and
yes,
it got resolved by the end of the episode.
sure, yes,
And
absolutely.
there was no continuity.
No, heavens no. In fact, I didn't realize that, I guess, The actual pilot wasn't that episode. It was Superman versus the Mole Men, which was filmed as a movie, and then they chopped up into an episode. It was all. It was always, yeah. The whole idea of continuity. Um, that's almost a fairly recent phenomenon, really.
Mhm.
But I was also struck that speaking of the mundanity of the adversaries, right? I mean, Superman's big thing that he does is help a guy who's hanging off of a blimp from falling to his death. I'm like, good for
Yes.
him, but right. For those that haven't seen the episode or don't recall, right, the way that Clark Kent's trying to get a job at the Daily Planet because he's figured out that if he can get a job at the Daily Planet, that's how he can be aware of breaking news stories that Superman can then use his powers to solve. And the big story is a dirigible at the local airport has broken free, and a bunch of people are hanging from a rope, and one guy's left on, and
Hmm.
somehow he hangs on long enough for Superman to arrive and get him down. And this is the big resolution.
Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah. Well, and I watched, as I mentioned, the episode with the Czar of the Underworld was the primary villain's name,
Well, sure.
who was out just to kill Clark Kent and the people behind the movie that they were making about him. The other one was I watched, which was about a an effort to chase off people who were effectively supplying the Daily Planet with paper. And so, for reasons unrelated to the Daily Planet, actually, it was some disgruntled person concocted a way to make everyone believe that there was a werewolf on the prowl in the area, out in the woods somewhere. And so, eventually, Clark Kent and Superman uncover this fiendish plot, which was headed by probably the actor with the worst French Canadian accent I have ever heard. Uh, Aha, monsieur, you are afraid of the wolf.
And they would
But
have
said
gotten
with
away
sort
with it
of,
too, right? If it
but
weren't for
said
you
with like
meddling Kryptonians.
said with a little bit of like an East Coast accent. It's really
Sure.
hard to recreate. I don't do voices. But that character served his purpose in the story and then disappeared. It wasn't like
Sure.
there was another Luthor episode coming up. It was just the problem of the week.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So I mean, therefore, I think it's not particularly surprising, especially for youths in the 1960s or early 1970s, that this would not be as compelling.
Yeah. Yeah. It was like the really lousy quote unquote dinosaur movies, of the
Mm,
50s and 60s where there might be a dinosaur and that's why you were watching it when you were a kid, but the
right.
dinosaur was in the movie for 5 minutes and
Sure.
the rest of it was a lot of just filler and needless plot twists about the humans and romantic hijinks or whatever. But it just, that wasn't the reason that you were watching this show or you were at the theater.
So I mean, beyond the TV show, and before we talk about comics, were there what other introductions to Superman did you have, or were there any others that you had?
That was pretty much it. That was
So
it for me.
I think for me it was toys, and again I don't know the sequencing at this point in my life. When what I saw, what, when, and where. I mean, again, like I had the Batman Mego figures, I had the Superman and
Hmm.
other superheroes. I had a talking Viewmaster. Again,
Hmm.
for those that have no idea what I'm talking about, a Viewmaster was this device that you had two eye like a binoculars to look into, and you put a disc in that had sort of uh, 3D pictures, right? And you would roll through the ViewMaster.
Yeah,
And I
because it
had a
was
fancy one.
stereoscopic. You had the
Yeah,
3D effect.
stereoscopic. That's
Yeah,
the word that
yeah.
I was trying not to say because I couldn't remember if that was the right word. Yeah, it was stereoscopic. And the one that I had actually had a little like a record on the back of it, and it would play sound along with the pictures. And I had one that was the origin of Superman coming to Earth, and that
Yeah.
probably the first time I saw the origin story of Superman was on a ViewMaster. Um, Very fancy. And then at some point, of course, it was Super Friend the Super Friends comics cartoon on TV
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. Before maybe I encountered the comics, although again it's a little jumbled in my brain.
Yeah, I watched later the cartoons a little bit, and I went and looked it up. I was, sure that there was an independent Superman cartoon, and there was. It was
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time there was the sort of it was called the Superman Aquaman Adventure Hour or something like that.
There's one with Superman and Batman. I thought was the Adventure
Yeah,
Hour, and then they
yeah,
broke off both of those into individual syndication.
and they were okay.
They were
They
all
were
right.
okay. There was also something that I very dimly remember. I sorry I didn't look this up, but well, I should have mentioned this when we were doing Batman. There was something that was like an 8-track tape that you would stick into a player. And I remember there were very clearly there was, I think it was a radio drama that they just had transferred to this format for Batman. That was a Joker episode. And there might have been a Superman one too. I kind of vaguely remember that, but that'd probably be my only other contact with the character when I was young, other than comics.
Right.
Um, can we go back to the TV show for a
Oh,
moment?
I'm sorry.
Just
Yes, I kind of I
yeah, just no, it's okay. It's good. So I just wanted to make one more point about the difference between the Batman TV show and the Superman TV show. The Batman TV show was clearly campy in a way that you could tell when you were a kid. And nonetheless, it had these serious moments or like the hint that things could be
right.
serious, which played a lot into what eventually kind of hooked me and you into the comics was when things were more serious in the comics.
Yes.
Superman was kind of the reverse. The Adventures of Superman was played sort of seriously
Yes.
with humorous touches. You'd have Clark Kent smirking quite a lot.
There was a lot of
Uh,
smirking.
he was a smirker.
And anytime Lois said something about, where were you, Clark, when Superman showed up, and like, haha.
Oh, I got stuck in a porta potty, Lois. And everyone would just nod. Okay, whatever.
Yes.
Clark is a doof. There was Jimmy's just nonstop ineptitude.
Yes.
There was Perry White's constant fulminating. But it was still kind of played straight
Yes.
as a show, which okay, for good or bad, that's what they did.
Well, it raises an interesting point, right? And in some ways, it is the same, I think, ongoing reality or tension. I'm not quite sure what word I want when we look at future comic book properties, right? Which
Mhm.
is how much should the adaptation be? Let's take this particular character and insert them into quote unquote reality and then play it like it was real. And how much do we make it more like a comic book reality? So
Right.
if you contrast those two shows, right? Superman is basically like, okay, here's all of this, is just a normal world, and we happen to have this one guy that has these powers, and how might he use them? Although not explored in a particularly serious way, but I mean in a deeply narratively serious way. But nonetheless, like we'll just pretend like this is what it is. It's not dissimilar from the Incredible Hulk program in the
Yeah,
1970s. It's
exactly.
um, Batman, at least, while it doesn't really, except for the Green Hornet and Kato episode, doesn't really think about an expanded universe of superheroes. It does try to portray the comic book reality both visually and also to take it more seriously by having the villains be predominantly
Hmm.
truly fantastical supervillains, right?
Yeah.
Um, and even later with, and not to foreshadow the movie discussion, but Superman the motion picture in some ways does this. Like there's just a singular person, and uh, even later Batman stuff, and not really until you get to MCU or even the Arrowverse TV programs or the DC universe movies do you have this sort of world that really takes seriously superheroes as being more than just the one, right?
Hmm.
Um, so that, but this sort of treatment of Superman is as kind of serious while still it's funny too, right? Because it's serious, but it's aimed at kids. Batman was more campy, but it was aimed at a multi-leveled audience. It's an interesting
Right.
contrast, right? And sort of the choices it made artistically about how to portray these types of characters on screen.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk regularly about humor in these properties too. Just,
Yes,
where do you inject that into the story? I mean, you were already talking about it, but I just think, there is that interesting balance.
yes,
You look at the first Spider-Man movies, the Sam Raimi ones,
yes,
or you look at the Tim Burton Batman movie and so forth. I mean, there's humor in there without it becoming a comedy or without it becoming too campy.
yes, that's right.
Just to reiterate what you were saying. All right.
So, what about the comics? So,
What
what
about the
was your experience
comics?
with the comics?
Well, so I was picking up Batman comics because as I was, driven by the TV show to investigate this whole genre. And I got a real mix of things. I mean, I remember reading everything from Batman to Metamorpho to Challengers of the Unknown to, other DC characters. And inevitably there'd be Superman there. And
Yes,
it just didn't grab me. For reasons we're probably going to beat to death in the
yes,
next 5 to 10 minutes, but it just didn't grab me.
no, yeah, yeah, I had the same experience. Again, like I said, my early comic reading was really kind of random. It was whatever was in those three comics in a bag situation, or
Yeah.
whatever happened to be purchased for me. And again, Superman is both ubiquitous but not central, and that's the part that I find sort of fascinating. I mean, he's
Yeah.
always there. I mean, I know I read Superman and Action and World's Finest and Justice League, and Superman was always present.
Hmm.
But he was never. I really and I went through the DC app and I looked at all the covers of Superman comics and Action comics specifically. Like, what do I remember? And unlike the Batman stories that either I remember as a child directly or that have been reinforced over my years of reading, there just aren't these Superman stories, individual issues, or storylines that really stick with me, or particular
Hmm.
creators that stick with me. Not until much later, right? I have much fonder memories of, and you mentioned the John Byrne run. I really enjoyed that run of Superman. And even some stuff that happened after that, I stick in my mind more than anything that happened before. Although still none of it is the same as other properties that I could name. Um, and I didn't, but by the same token, well, I was going to say I didn't particularly like I didn't Kurt Swain's art didn't do it for me. I didn't much care for the house style of Superman.
No.
I avoided at the time or just didn't have access to. I didn't find like Lois Lane's adventures all that interesting, or Jimmy Olsen's. Although I have read subsequently the Jack Kirby run on the Jimmy Olsen book, which is actually bonkers and kind of interesting. But that's its own side conversation more about Jack Kirby than is about Superman. Um, but just the only memory that I have, I don't know why. I remember, I don't even know what issue. I should have looked it up and I didn't. There's an issue in which Clark Kent is sitting in for Steve Allen because they look so much alike. That sticks in my head, but I mean, like, come on, that's not Ra's al Ghul
Yeah.
or the stuff that I remember from Batman. It's kind of just a
Yeah.
funny, weird side note.
Well, we talked about this a little bit last time that DC had the cover driven story.
Yes,
So there would be some gimmick on the cover. So Superman is dead. Superman is morbidly obese. Superman is a villain suddenly.
yes,
Superman runs a race with the Flash.
yes,
One I read recently was the caveman Superman. Oh my God. Superman finds his skeleton in a cave that's been there for
yes,
1 million years. I mean, there's so many awful things about this
yes,
particular issue of Superman. But anyway, and very often then, and this is probably what I clued into as a kid, the story behind the cover wasn't that great.
that's right.
Like the caveman Superman was just awful. Of course, it violated the coexistence of cavemen and dinosaurs at the same time. The whole story was just badly done. The dialogue was unreadable. It just was bad. It was like when Saturday Night Live skits have been expanded to movies, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. Not
Yeah.
every idea plays out in some longer form. Those covers didn't always really translate into something that was worth reading 20 some pages.
No, and quite clearly there was a disconnect between, hey, draw this cover versus who was doing the book inside,
Yeah.
because it wasn't always the same people. Quite frankly, it was not the same people back in that time period.
Yeah, it almost
Um,
felt like this was what Superman told Lois Lane. I'm jumping ahead to where they're married. Like
right,
he woke up and said, "Oh God, Lois, I had this weird dream where like you were a queen and you were trying to execute me with a guillotine, and
right.
Jimmy was there, but he was a porcupine." And it
There were
had
these
that sort of weird dream logic to the ideas.
there were these three woodsmen, and two of them never spoke.
Yes.
Anyway, anyway, um, yeah, I tell you what it was. I think as a kid, I didn't care for it. It felt like a bait and switch,
Yes. Yes. Well
and
said.
yeah, and that was like not that interesting ultimately. Um, but on the flip side, right? I think what I'm struck by is somehow I also managed to absorb quite a lot of the mythology, right?
Yes.
Whether it's the very Luthor and Brainiac and the Superboy stuff, the Bottle City of Candor, all the Krypton stuff, the Supergirl
Hmm.
stuff, the Legion of Superheroes, all of that
Crypto.
nonetheless. Crypto, right? Um, Became really still quite significant and difficult to ignore. Although it always did feel a bit more silly than Batman's backstory,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, by
or
virtue of
even
the character.
the Rogues Gallery for the Flash or something. It just
Yeah.
or and then the contrast something you mentioned a couple episodes back about Neil Adams and the Green Lantern Green Arrow run in the 70s. It's just far more interesting
Yeah.
and serious
Yeah.
than Superman ever
Yeah.
was, to me at least.
Yeah, and DC stuck with its formula with Superman. The Kurt Swan art,
Yes.
the way that you had these cover-driven stories that were wrapped up in a single issue, and with a few exceptions I found from rereading some of the comics from this period, but because of their sales, like I looked up what were the most popular titles published at this time. So like 1965 through 1969, Superman.
Yeah.
1965, Superman, Superboy, Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, Action Comics. Then later Archie Comics became a big thing, and you go to 1968, best-selling comics: Superman, Archie, Batman, World's Finest, Superboy.
Yep.
Yeah, they really led with Superman for a reason. It was a commercial success, and all the offshoots, that came. For me as a reader, those did more harm than good, because I think like Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane comics were even goofier than the Superman
Oh,
one,
absolutely.
and the whole Legion of Superheroes was kind of lost on me. That Superboy can travel to the future, and there are all these teenagers who are superheroes because apparently there are not child labor laws in the future.
Well, they're all lads and lasses, don't you know?
Yes, yes.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, it was just also more fantastical, even like things like the Bottle City of Candor stories with he and Jimmy Olsen would go and they would be superheroes in Candor.
Yeah.
Um, all very just I don't know. It was just more fantastical, I guess, than and not I and maybe this is both of our sensibilities. I was always was more intrigued by sort of consistent mythology and storytelling and sort of deeper stories than all this sort of weird offshoot stuff.
Right. It's odd to talk about this phrase in terms of comic book characters, but suspension of disbelief.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, at least if you think that there probably isn't much of a chance of ever being a Batman, it was at least within the realm of saying, okay, I can buy into this enough that I could get through a Batman comic. But Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen turns into a version of Mr. Mxyzptlk, or
Elastic Lad.
Jimmy, yeah, Jimmy turns into a devil, or he has a demon puppet duplicate, which were some of the stories I looked at when I was researching this episode. I mean, that was like over some sort of very hard to describe line. It's like,
Right.
oh come on,
That's right. That's
oh
right.
come on,
I agree.
and that stupid watch of his, Z Z Z.
So maybe we can shift and talk about the movie in 1979.
Yeah. Before we do, though, I want to say a little bit about TV in the 70s,
Okay.
superhero TV in the 70s, because I think it has something to do with the success of the Superman movie. So even though I didn't love Superman the comic or the Adventures of Superman the TV show, if in the 1970s there had been a Superman TV show, I would have watched it
Of
because
course.
I still had hope, right? And
Right.
it was an era when there were other comic book characters on TV that were popular: Wonder Woman, The
Hmm.
Incredible Hulk,
Hmm.
lesser known things like there was a Doctor Strange movie, and so forth. So there was always the chance that something would pop out of the popular culture woodwork and turn out to be a good version of Superman. Um, since it's the 1970s, I'm sure half the villains would have been guys in turtlenecks and sport coats, but I would still have watched it.
Of course.
So let's talk about the movie when it did debut.
Right.
Yeah. Did you see it in the theater
I saw it in
or?
the theater, so I was, that was at that point. I guess I'm 11 or 12. Don't remember. I forget what month it came out, but so I'm going to the movies at this point.
Mhm.
Um, and saw it in the theater, and it was certainly, it was at that period when movies were becoming, well, in my own life there was a certain magic to go along with movies, and also I think movies were amplifying in this genre era that we're talking about, because Star Wars had come out, Star Trek: The Motion Picture had come out. This sort of the magisterialness of these special effects and the music and all these things they become amplified, right, in a way that was,
Mhm.
I think, significant. And Superman certainly fit into that category with, I just, the title sequence, right, and the John Williams music, and
Right.
it is iconic. And so, the I saw it in that context. I assume you saw it in the theater as well.
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. And I was floored. As I said, I'd spent by that time, many hours reading comic books and not loving Superman. Along with that, became a comic book collector. Well, we had the comic book store, and I just, I remember watching it, with my jaw practically on the floor, thinking, "Wow, somebody finally got it." Right. And
Yeah.
not that, even though the I felt like the comic book had dropped the ball and the TV show had done the same, this movie was really what I expected a superhero, in fact, this specific superhero on screen to look like.
I think that's really important, right? It was certainly, to me, it was the first time on screen I felt like there was some real um, resonance between the comic book itself and what's on the page, and then what was on the screen, right?
Yeah.
It definitely amplified the capacity to sort of reflect what a superhero should look like on screen. Again, if you compare it to the TV show, you compare it to even the Batman TV show, or the Incredible Hulk, or Wonder Woman, or the Spider-Man movie, or the TV show, and at the time, and Captain America, it was just paled in comparison. Those all looked like fakes. This looked real,
Right.
relatively
Yeah.
speaking. Um, and as the tagline said, you'll believe a man can fly. That, much more than the whooshing
Yes.
George Reeves coming through the window.
Yeah.
It was certainly revolutionary, I think, in that sense.
Yeah, definitely. And it started out on a serious note, with the Krypton
Yes.
scenes. I was saying before about seriousness versus humor, as we were talking about, there it was established that this was a movie that kind of took the material seriously.
Hmm.
Then kind of tied in well with the rest of the story, Superman's origin. It didn't take too long.
That's right.
Kind of get from there to the Superman we know doing Superman-like things.
That's right. That's right. It was, yeah. I think, and again, in the context of the podcast, it is a good example of the elevation of genre specific, in this particular comic book, characters in particular becoming a mass consumption item,
Right.
right? Because the
Yeah.
movie was very successful.
Yeah. And Christopher Reeve was terrific.
He
I felt
was.
that from the moment I saw him on the screen. Uh, Lois Lane wasn't a mannequin.
That's right.
She was like a real person with real agency, and that was
Yes.
great.
Yeah, it
Even
was.
though she got put into danger and Superman had to save her, it wasn't like she was just this sort of shrinking violet the way that she had been often in the comics or the TV show. And the all the work that went into the practical effects really paid off.
Oh,
Uh,
it did. It
yeah,
did.
people can go read about like how they did the cape or the scene
Right.
with the helicopter falling off the building and so forth. I mean, that's fascinating stuff we won't cover here. I'll just say my own reaction was just, wow, that was great.
Yeah, it was very, very impressive. And to your point, or to contrast the point you made previously about the television show, the acting was
Hmm.
far better in the movie.
Oh my God, yes.
You've got Gene Hackman being Lex Luthor, and you've got real actors, and um, it was
Yeah.
substantially better.
I mean, it wasn't perfect.
No, it wasn't perfect.
Some of the camp elements they put in went a little too far, like with Luthor's henchperson Otis,
Yes,
or Miss Teschbacher's
Tessmacher,
outfits,
yeah,
Tessmacher
yes,
or whatever her name was.
yeah, I think.
Yeah, okay, but it was it didn't have to be perfect.
No, it didn't. And flying around the Earth to make time go backwards. I'm still not sure how that
Right.
works, but that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't thrilled with him inventing new superpowers in later movies, but
You
uh
mean throwing his logo at people?
yeah, yeah.
Although I have to admit, I mean, of course, you're from California. I moved to California. I didn't fully appreciate the whole San Andreas Fault, Southern California falling to the ocean thing until I
Oh,
moved out
right.
there. I'm like, oh yeah, I get it. Everyone lives in a little narrow strip on
Yeah,
the
near
West
the coast.
Coast.
Well, I mean, other people did live inland, but
Well,
that
yes,
was where the focus was.
yes,
If you lived in California, was the beach adjacent
where the money
areas.
is, which
Yeah,
yes,
where the big money was.
yes, yes.
So it's worth saying it was a huge box office success. I looked up; it was 300 million worldwide versus a 55 million dollar budget.
Yeah.
Um, I don't recall a lot of merchandising around it. I'm sure it was there, but not anything that I just really had to have. And it might have been because I was, in my late teens by then. So
That's a good point, though. I mean, now that you
yeah.
mention it, I really hadn't thought about it. I mean, there had to have been. I mean, I seem to recall some merchandising. I don't know that I owned anything. I was still in that period of my life, very much. So I'm in my early, like I said, I think I'm 11 or 12 about this point in time, and so I'm still, with Star Wars action figures and all that kind of thing. And I don't recall there being anything that was specifically appealing to me, from that. That's interesting. They didn't capitalize on toys that much. No, not to my
No.
recollection.
And oddly, I found out didn't inspire a lot of imitators. And
Yeah.
I'm sure somebody listening to this is going to correct me on this. It's like, well, what about this Indian knockoff of Superman? But I looked at the TV shows of the 70s, sorry, the 80s, kind of, since the Superman movie was 1979, you would think there would have been this, wake that something that was that successful would create, where there were a bunch of other comic book based TV and movie properties, and there actually weren't.
No, there weren't.
There actually were more before then. I mentioned, you know, Wonder Woman, the Incredible Hulk, there were also sort of not exactly comic book characters, but like, the $6 Million Man was
Right.
clearly a superhero and so
Yes.
forth. There was just looking at the history of this, it seemed like there was more in the 1970s of superheroes on the screen than there was immediately after the Superman movie.
No, I think that's accurate. I
Other than
mean,
the sequels, but
yeah, the sequels. I mean, we'll speak not of Superman for the Quest for Peace. Um,
what is this movie?
yeah.
There was a Superman 4.
Oh my goodness. Um, let alone Superman 3. But
Hey, Superman 3 had the nightmare inducing scene of the woman being turned into effectively a Borg.
I'm blanking on this.
Oh yeah.
I've seen I saw the I've seen clips of it recently, but I don't remember that part. I just Richard Pryor as the bad guy is a bit much. But anyway, or comic relief, whatever you call it.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, he was a guy with a scheme who
yeah, he was the guy with the
kind of ran
scheme.
afoul of much worse people.
Yes, exactly. His rounding error scheme. Anyway, yeah, they did go downhill. I mean, Superman 2 has some things to say for it, but after
Hmm.
that, boy, it is a whole different ball game. Um, but no, you're right. I really hadn't thought about it too much, but I mean, the only and there's got to be other examples. The only superhero TV show that I can think of in the 80s was The Greatest American Hero.
Yeah.
But yeah, there wasn't and I don't know. There is this sort of sense, and this is probably a topic for a different episode, but that era of movie making, and to some degree, therefore, that era of television, um, there was this sense that the special effects were so expensive and so complicated that
Hmm.
those movies were only come out, in it would take years between movies,
Right.
and the willingness of studios to fully invest seemed limited, and you couldn't really translate a lot of that stuff to the small screen the way you can now.
Right.
I mean, the only example I can even think of would, in the wake of Star Wars, you get Battlestar Galactica, um, but even that only lasted, well, 2 years if you count the Galactica 1980. But it was clearly, if they even did special effects, they would invest in a certain set amount and they would just repeat them over and over again on screen.
Right.
Um, and so you just don't get the kind of replication you get now, or the sort of attempt
No.
to imitate. Even
Well,
even Go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say, and maybe that was a good thing
Yeah.
because uh, part of the problem we were talking about with the Superman comic was they always have to come up with a gimmick.
Yes.
It was a magic or the 30-second version of kryptonite that the writers came up with or something versus, all right, you've got a Superman movie, you've got Lex Luthor, he has a scheme, Superman struggling to keep up with all of the shenanigans that Luthor is doing. And then in the next movie, you have three other Kryptonians who are his adversaries. And if you had to do that every year
Yeah.
or twice a year, or in a TV show of that vintage, every week, I think that the odds are you would come up with the same sort of uh, unfortunate sort of gimmicks in order to keep Superman challenged.
Or yeah, or the converse is that you have a repeat of the Adventures of Superman where he's fighting just common criminals.
Right.
The only comparison that comes to mind, and this would be in the 90s, was that, remember there was that Flash TV show that really was in the aftermath of the Batman movie,
Oh yeah, yeah.
which was at the time I thought fairly well done, but also suffered from the fact that for the most part the Flash was just fighting like mobsters and stuff. It was not
Right.
that interesting after a while.
Yeah.
And I mean, and this relates back to the Batman TV show. Part of what made Batman fascinating was the villains. It wasn't just Batman, right?
Right.
You take that show and you just have Batman fighting regular criminals every week, and it's nowhere near as interesting. Which is,
Yeah.
but that I think was the part of the problem of the Adventures of Superman and many other superhero properties that were on the screen, small screen in particular, was the mundanity of the adversaries.
Yeah.
And that's just not fun, right?
Yeah, unless you kind of reduce the power level of Superman
Yes, that's right.
somehow, because there was the radio show and
Hmm.
before there was a TV show and so forth. But if I recall, and I haven't listened to the radio show in a long time, but if I recall correctly, he wasn't as super as he was certainly in the comics.
Oh no, I mean, that's sort of the case that if you go back over time, literally his power was supposed to be that he could jump over buildings, not that he could fly.
Right.
And those powers, the
And he
power
was
suite,
stronger.
yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, not just, I mean, flying around the earth fast enough to make it rotate backwards. But I remember an episode, an issue of it was DC Comics Presents, I'm pretty sure.
Hmm.
The team up book that he had,
Yeah.
and it was with Adam Strange, and somehow the planet ran and Earth got transposed in space, and then they got teleported back, and Superman had to push the Earth back into its proper orbit.
Right.
And that's pretty powerful.
Yeah. Or there was a team up with Dr. Fate where I remember there was a great Neil Adams cover where he's effectively a sort of chained to the earth and he's like
Yes,
straining to pull it
yes,
forward.
yes.
Or the dumb caveman Superman story I was mentioning. He just kind of glibly says, this is a interesting mystery finding my skeleton here in this cave. Let me just fly back in time.
That's right.
Dot dot dot.
Right.
All of this was presented as just kind of effortless on his part.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, it's the scale is a problem.
Yeah.
Scale of powers it is. But
Yeah. So, I mean, the movie, again, as we talked about with Batman, I think demonstrated that you could do something that appealed to both kids and adults.
yes.
It definitely hit a nerve. I mean, there's, generations now of people who have seen the movie and can quote particular lines from it and so forth. So also pretty well written. I think that was the other thing
I think that's correct, yes.
that's worth
It
mentioning.
was well written, well acted. I think the music is very important. I think that the effects, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
It's a well done movie. It fits into that again, that period of time from Star Wars on, and I don't know. Again, partly it's this. I think this just reflected partially my age, but right it was just the string of movies from
Hmm.
the Star Wars movies, the Indiana Jones movies, various Spielberg movies,
Yeah.
and Superman is in that same period of time where there's just an elevation, I think, of one science fiction movies being, I think, taken seriously and also being of mass success in ways that was less prominent, I think, in the past.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that this caused the adjustment to the character, but we alluded to earlier, there was sort of this hesitate to use the much overused word reboot of the character several years after the movie. And that was something that DC had steadfastly resisted changing the Superman formula, as we already discussed.
Oh
But
yes,
it certainly didn't hurt that there was a commercially successful movie that appealed to grown-ups and kids both. And then eventually, not just Superman, but also like the Legion of Superheroes and so forth, changed in the 1980s and 1990s to become, not the same old formula that we've probably talked enough about already, but
right.
you get the point,
Yep.
listeners. All right, some big questions to wrap up.
Okay.
Are we looking forward to the new movie?
I think I am actually, and again, I really have not. Obviously, we've already sort of indicated our sort of lukewarm feeling about the character in many ways, but yeah, I found the trailer intriguing enough. It felt more possibly fun and interesting than more recent iterations of Superman. The Schneider stuff did not really appeal to me that much.
No.
Um, and and so I'm intrigued more than I perhaps expected to be.
Yeah,
How
me
about you?
too. Yeah, I mean it really got me going seeing the trailer. I and usually, you know, I regret being excited for movies that are coming up uh, when I actually see the work product. But in
Right.
this particular case, at least I have the feeling that James Gunn isn't doing something necessarily too tongue in cheek. It does seem to be motivated by a love of not just Superman, but Superman in DC Comics in like the late 80s, early 90s, you know, when you had Guy Gardner and Mr. Terrific and, you know, Hawk Girl and so forth. I mean, it seems to reflect some of that. I mean, I'm pretty excited about it. And I think it was a great idea, as I said, to show Superman at a low point at the beginning of the trailer and also to have crypto. And
I was kind of surprised that I was pleased to see crypto because I always, in some ways, thought that was all kind of silly, but it's also fun, right?
yeah, absolutely. And the way they did it in the trailer at
Yes,
least was
it
was
was very
terrific.
nice. Yeah, and there's some interesting visuals in that trailer that I find intriguing.
Okay.
Like when he runs in front of the girl and saves the little girl during the sort of explosion.
Yeah.
Very heroic, very Superman in that sense. I was also pleased that they brought back the John Williams music. I hope it's prominent in the film. I think, to me, that music is just it's so emblematic of the character. It seems odd not to have used it in previous iterations, to be honest. Although I understand the
Yeah.
desire to be new and different, but
Yeah. So my second question, thinking as we have about old Superman and looking ahead to, you know, the next movie incarnation of Superman, does the character need updating for modern audiences?
that's a good question. I mean what would you think of as updating?
I'm leaving that deliberately vague.
I think
Because
that
he has been updated to some extent. You mentioned all the other
yeah,
TV shows that came out. I kind of think that the characters around Superman need to be updated, but kind of
yes,
the essence of what is Superman is this image of hope and, you know, American ideals and dedication to doing the right thing and so forth. I don't think that part needs to be updated,
right.
and that's what really was a downer about the Snyder movies. Uh,
Yes. Well, I mean, in some ways, yeah. Is it updating or is it in some ways kind of going back to certain things that did work with the character?
yeah,
I just have a had a hard time with Superman being quite as the whole grimdark thing that Schneider likes to do. I just it didn't quite
yeah,
work for me. Um, I think maybe in some ways toning some of his powers down a little bit might not be a bad move. Um,
right,
you know, as you point out, he is shown as wounded in that trailer. I have been somewhat amused to watch some of the various comic book oriented forum that I look at, whether it's on Facebook or on Reddit or whatever. Some people saying, "Well, Superman doesn't bleed," and then everyone's showing plenty of pictures of Superman bleeding in the comics over
yes,
a multi-decade period of time. So this is not like some truly new phenomenon. Um, so I don't know how much of it's upgrading or just recalibrating is really what I'm
hmm
interested in. I do agree that I'll be curious to see, and I've done some reading of more contemporary Superman of late. I wouldn't say that I'm fully understand everything is in play right now. I mean, we have he has a son and lots of things are different, and he and Lois are together. But
hmm
I do find that the Lois Lane characterizations that I've read in more recent books is, I think, a good characterization
yeah,
that I would like to see manifested in the films. Um, I mean, certainly not the old cover stories of every episode, every issue. It seemed of the Lois Lane comic book where she's pining away to marry Superman.
oh God,
Um,
yeah, oh, those are so painful.
yes, they are.
You don't even have to read the comic. You just have to look at the cover.
Yes, exactly. Um, so I think in that regard, yeah, the universe needs a little bit of calibration, and I would expect to
Yeah.
see that in this film. I mean, again, I have some trust. I think James Gunn did a good job with the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. I feel like he
hmm
understands the comic book sensibility, but also uh, this is balance with comics and comic characters between taking them seriously for what they are, but also realizing that they are in fact these larger than life,
Right.
colorful, fantastical entities, and how do you balance those things off? And as you say, or as you alluded to earlier, humor, I think, is an important part of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's, I think that one of the challenges of any superhero property is the balance between taking it too seriously versus not seriously enough, and that's the hard part.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah. Okay. I think that covers everything. I think we touched on a lot, how do you make a superpowered character interesting, at the level of superpower that Superman has. I think that's a problem in general for
It
for
is.
for superheroes. It's not just for Superman. So I just wanted to mention that before we left. I think it is the kind of the
No, and I think
nature
it
of,
does boil down to what's the conundrum being solved? What's the
yeah.
nature of the villain?
Hmm.
Um, I think one of the difficulties of Superman, which maybe be partially reflected in some of the Snyder stuff, is if you take his powers too seriously, it becomes apocalyptic in a way that is really beyond relatability, right? I mean, if
Right.
that kind of unleashing of power, it well, how about this? I mean, it's one of the things that has occasionally been joked about in recent years about comic books, um, but the devastation that really would take place from these fights would become almost
Yes.
impossible to deal with. I mean, how many times has New York been like destroyed in Marvel Comics, for example, or in this case, Metropolis? It's it's almost unbearably ridiculous, really, if you take it seriously.
Oh, yeah.
So trying to sort of deal with that aspect of it is challenging.
Well, and to have that level of power and deal with, in many respects, kind of the most mundane problems. I mean, the
Yes.
old. Sorry to keep going back to flogging the Superman comics of the '60s, but it's like, okay, you have these incredible powers, and you're kind of dealing with people who are robbers,
Yes.
or or really these bizarre situations involving aliens who come to visit for a day to the Earth, or an
Right.
imp from another dimension who comes
Yes.
to visit just to be irritating. Are there not other things Superman should be doing? Just a question.
No, that's right. That's right. Um, that's
And I
the
think
challenge.
like the modern comics have dealt with that a bit,
Yes.
but at the time it's like, really? That's it?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so I think we have covered Superman the TV show, the Superman comics of the '60s and '70s, the Superman movie. Next time, we're going to go into another real pillar of our young geek lives, which is Star Trek, the original series. So
Looking forward to it.
yeah, I would say if the listeners strap in on that one, we're going to have a lot to say about that.
I expect.
Brain is brain. What is brain?
Oh,
Just to warm up. Just to
indeed.
warm up.
Indeed.
All right, my friend.
All right. Until next time.
Till next time. That does it for episode 2 of Ancient Geeks. Thanks for listening. If you have feedback, suggestions, praise, outrage, or any other reactions, contact us at someancientgeeks@gmail.com. Look for us on Facebook, Blue Sky, and other social media outlets to come. We're always grateful for a review on the podcast app of your choice. Aside from the feedback, we are also grateful because reviews help people find us, and as a new podcast, people need help finding us. All content copyright 2025, Tom Grant and Stephen Taylor. Music by Reversed Image, whom you can find on Pixabay. See you next time.